Welcome you today to today's event, which is entitled Incorporating Human Rights-Based Approaches to the Conservation, Restoration, and Sustainable Use of Biodiversity, a UN interagency and multi-stakeholder discussion. The event is jointly organized by the Secretariat of the United Nations Environment Management Group, we'll refer to that as the EMG, in collaboration with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and the UNDP, the UN Development Program. My name is Terence Hady. I am a program manager in UNDP on local action, Indigenous peoples and nature with the GF Small Grants Program, and I will be your moderator. The event continues with a series of webinars that have been taking place throughout this year as part of the activities of the EMG Issue Management Group on Biodiversity, with the overall objective of increasing awareness and knowledge of the UN common approach to biodiversity and to strengthen interagency dialogue and cooperation on the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which we will refer to as the GBF. The webinar is part of a sub-series of events around human rights and biodiversity, aimed at, as we mentioned, on focusing on this interconnection between conservation, restoration, and human rights, along with the equitable benefit sharing of the of biodiversity and on the dissemination of best practices and lessons. So the webinar will last for 90 minutes. We will focus mainly on an interactive panel discussion after the keynote presentation. So to get us started, I'd like to hand over the floor to Ms. Janneke Pitkanen, who is the Program Management Officer in the UN EMG. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Terence, for this introduction. On behalf of the EMG, the Environment Management Group Secretariat, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, which is, as Terence mentioned, one in a series of events that the EMG is organizing related to the implementation of the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity. And it's organized in the context of the EMG's work on interagency collaboration, on biodiversity, as well as on human rights and the environment. The series of events has the objective to not only increase awareness and knowledge about the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, but in a broader context also to contribute to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and to strengthen interagency dialogue and cooperation on biodiversity, ultimately with the objective to improve UN system support to member states in the implementation of the GBF. We have covered a wide range of topics, and the series aims to facilitate learning from experience out there, highlighting good or even best practice that can strengthen the work that all of us do to support the biodiversity plan and its vision, goals, and targets. Today, together with OHCHR and UNDP, we are kicking off this sub-series of events that is focusing on the incorporation of a human rights-based approach in a biodiversity context. We have invited the participation of different UN agencies and other key stakeholders to build capacity in the incorporation of these approaches and the equitable sharing of benefits from biodiversity utilization. In the common approach to biodiversity, UN entities express a shared recognition of the urgency to address the drivers of biodiversity loss and also commit to mainstreaming biodiversity through better coordinated efforts across the system. And in the area specifically of human rights, peaceful societies, and planetary stability, the common approach highlights as a strategic objective for the UN for instance, the need to prioritize persons, groups, and people in vulnerable situations, especially those who rely on natural resources for subsistence and cultural identity, and those who are disproportionately affected by environmental degradations, that this is prioritized. Furthermore, the common approach highlights the call to action for human rights, including promoting the human right to a healthy environment and ensure the protection of environmental human rights defenders. The common approach considers the intersection of human rights and biodiversity as a key factor for sustainable development. And in this context, we are really excited to hear more from our speakers on this topic today. And we hope that participants will engage actively in the discussion throughout the webinar. And with this background and context provision, I would like to thank all of you for joining the webinar today and hand it back over to you, Terence. Thanks. You're muted, Terence.
Yeah, thank you, Jannica. So we will hopefully have a very interactive session. Do post comments, questions in the chat box. We will now move to the keynote presentation, which will be by Ms. Astrid Fuentes Riaño, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I think that was renamed. It used to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment, who will present the overarching principles for the incorporation and implementation of human rights-based approaches for conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of biodiversity. Astrid has more than 20 years of experience on environmental law, human rights, and climate change and their intersection, with a perspective on climate justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has worked for and with communities, environmental defenders, and indigenous peoples in Latin America, contributing to the protection of their rights and territories, including in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. She has advised several organizations and collaborated with the UN system, including with the UN Human Rights Office in Mexico, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So thank you very much, Astrid, for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Terence, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. And thank you very much, first of all, for organizing this very important series of conversations and for the invitation to contribute to them. And thinking about why it's important and how can we incorporate and make sure that human rights-based approaches are included in conservation. I think that the first thing that I want to say, an invitation, is think about and see where are we at. And I think that the key place to start is realize what is the situation today, that of course, and we repeat this a lot, that we are facing currently a triple planetary crisis with biodiversity loss, but also climate change and pollution. And this is not to continue repeating, but to really think about what is working and what is not working. And I think that that is one of the key elements that we as people that are working from the UN in very different offices and programs have to think about. And this is not only from the thinking about a program or a policy. One of the things that the triple planetary crisis is showing is how humanity has to reconnect and really realize what is that is, in the first place, has put us in the place that we are. And that is linked with this connection with nature and thinking that humans are different from nature, but also about this idea of over-specializing. And in that over-specialization, we have, unfortunately, implement a lot of work that is compartmentalized and in silos. And I think that if we think, even when we were studying at the university, human rights was seen in one road or one channel, and conservation on the environment is another. When we know, and of course, everyone that is working in the ground see that human rights and nature and conservation has to be together. This is especially important because the evidence that we're seeing, and painfully is reminded us, is that conservation efforts and that are ongoing are not working. And we are seeing this including on efforts such as forest conservation, that it was a way to protect the environment, at least for from one perspective, but has demonstrated that it's not only ineffective, but also has been a source of a lot of human rights violations, including Indigenous peoples violations, where not only a lot of these efforts are not effectively conserving the environment and the biodiversity that we absolutely need to protect, but also has been a source of a lot of conflict. And I mean, I don't have to go in detail on that, but that is one of the things that I think that is very important to analyze and to learn from. What is that we are not doing correctly, and what are the changes and profound changes that we need? As we know, and the IPCC has concluded in their global assessment report, that we need transformative changes. They specifically concluded that the goals for conserving and sustainably using nature and achieving sustainability cannot be made by current trajectories, and goals for 2030 and beyond may only be achieved through transformative changes across economic, social, political, and technological factors. That is a conclusion that scientists working on conservation have showed, and that's one of the key things that we, as mentioned, have to see, like that we cannot continue doing exactly the same. And human rights and the incorporation of human rights as mainstream is a key opportunity to catalyze different kind of actions. Also, science has showed that systematically that Indigenous peoples and other communities that are based on the territories and ecosystem that are better conserved today have showed how they have been key guardians of these territories. And so that's one of the key things that human rights approaches can bring. The fact that how Indigenous peoples and other communities have key knowledge that we need to mainstream, learn from, and also incorporate to implement better ways to conserve nature that today, as I mentioned, are not, and we have not been implementing effectively. So that's one of the key things that including strong human rights approaches can bring, actual incorporation of different human rights, specifically protecting Indigenous peoples and other communities that are based on the areas where we need to conserve. But thinking also not only about those areas and biodiversity isolated, but even in urban and rural areas and more isolated areas. We have to also think about conserving nature as in a comprehensive way. Urban areas are key to conserve, not only for greening rural areas, but the connection that these areas have to other ecosystems that are more isolated and less intervened. Thinking about cooperation and collaboration is also key because, as I mentioned, we are connected with nature, as we know, and that is a reminder that the recognition of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment achieves. As we know, the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was recognized by the Human Rights Council in Resolution 4813 in October 2021. And then the General Assembly also recognized this right in the resolution as 76300 in July 2022. And a key reminder of this recognition is that human rights are interdependent, indivisible, and universal. So we should not be thinking about which human right to protect or how to protect separately, but together in an integral way. And that is another key thing that the human rights law contributes with these principles of interdependency, indivisibility, and universality. So we do not have to think about whether to protect the environment or human rights, but how to do it together. There are many existing tools and solutions that help us to bring this together, including, and this is a key aspect that the protection of the human right to a healthy environment brings, and it's not only that healthy biodiversity and ecosystems are a key element of the human right to a healthy environment. And so when we protect the human right to a healthy environment, we also need to protect and make sure that we have healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, but we also have the procedural elements that are also rights, including access to information, access to participation, and access to justice, that are three pillars to make sure and are key for incorporating and advancing the protection of biodiversity and including more effective conservation and even restoration. When we are seeing, and over we see that in states and conserving the environment, it's very difficult, really impossible for only one actor to protect the environment. But when we have access to information and participation and access to justice, we also have a lot of other actors with knowledge, as I mentioned, like Indigenous peoples, also youth, women, children, with very important knowledge and a lot of other tools and possibilities to participate and have and achieve the other tools and solutions that today either UN entities or only states are not able to and haven't been able to see. The final element that I wanted to mention is also that, as we can see, businesses are in large part responsible for the biodiversity loss, also linked to climate change and pollution. And so the protection of all human rights, including the human right to a healthy environment, help us to advance accountability and control and effective monitoring that we need in order to comprehensively be able to advance the tools and the solutions that we are not seeing today. It is, of course, time, and we are already seeing this in addition in the global biodiversity framework, and we need to see this also on the tools that states implement this nationally, that we need the whole society at the same time. So we need human rights protection, access to justice, access to participation, and access to information, and be able to effectively protect human rights, because if not, we will continue doing the same thing that, as we know and as we see, is not reflecting and achieving the results that we need. Unfortunately, we have seen also the perspective with this isolated, and this is what I want to close, about either one thing, or like protecting the environment or protecting human rights, or this competition about winning or losing. We have to go over that. We need to bridge with human rights, with collaboration, with more cooperation, because doesn't matter how strong an actor or the UN can be, we cannot do it alone. And when we see this, and so this is one of the key things that the human rights perspective is helping to make sure that we have a comprehensive approach, and that we are implementing and putting people at the center, that, as we have seen in many examples, when Indigenous peoples and other communities are also involved and other people are involved, we can have better and more effective solutions and protection, and at the end, strategies to be able to better protect the environment, so that we can finally advance effective solutions for the protection of conservation, for restoration, and for an actual sustainable biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid, for those remarks. So we will now be moving to the panel. So Astrid, you mentioned the different actors and voices on access to justice. We will have a panel of four speakers, which I will introduce shortly. I would just like to comment on one of the points, Astrid, you made about over-specialization and compartmentalization. Going into the GBF, we heard some perceptions that on the one hand, that the CBD was not a human rights convention. I think we now have a a text with the GBF which does incorporate human rights very clearly. In terms of today's discussion, the word restoration is included. So we also see increasing synergies between conventions, between the work on climate and land, the UNCCD. So this year's COP16 and next year's COP30 will be exploring this idea of increased integration across conventions as well, addressing the point on compartmentalization, which we can come back to. So I will now introduce the panelists. This will take a few minutes. I'll introduce all three of them, and then we will have an interactive session with Ben, Phoebe, and Josefa. So the first person I'll introduce is Josefa Tauli. She's the policy coordinator at the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which we'll refer to as Gibbon, which is a recognized international youth coordination platform for the CBD. Sefa is an indigenous Igorot youth from the Cordilleras region of the Philippines. He's been involved in youth delegations for more than 10 rounds of the CBD negotiations of the Kunming GBF, so she knows it well, and played a key role in engaging youth in those discussions, including on human rights. She's also an advocacy officer for Partners of Indigenous Knowledge in the Philippines, and is one of 7 members of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. So welcome, Sefa. Our second panelist will be Ms. Phoebe Ndiema, Project Officer at the Chep Kitale Indigenous Peoples Development Project in Kenya. She comes from the Ogyek community in the northwest part of the country in Mount Elgon. She's currently working with CIPDP to pursue topics around tenure rights, environmental rights, and the human rights of the Ogyek. She's been leading on on gender justice mapping work, and the development of community-led biodiversity monitoring systems under a program on transformative pathways funded by the government of Germany. The third speaker today will be Mr. Ben Schachter from who's the Environmental and Climate Change Team Coordinator at the OHCHR. Ben's work focuses on the advancement of human rights for clean, healthy, and sustainable environment through improved understanding of human rights on human rights impact of climate change and other forms of environmental degradation, involving the corresponding obligations and responsibilities of states and other duty bearers, and the empowerment of people affected by environmental harm. So prior to joining OHCHR, Ben worked as an attorney in the United States and as a research assistant to the former UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples at the University of Arizona. So now we will move into the interactive Q&A session. Do please post any questions or comments in the chat box, which we can share with the three presenters. So we will have 4 guiding questions, and each of the interactive responses will be 3 to 4 minutes. So on the first question is on the interlinkages between biodiversity and human rights, and it is as follows. So what are the interlinkages on this topic of biodiversity and human rights from your different perspectives? Why is it important that biodiversity action respect, protect, and fulfill human rights? And who are the duty, responsibility bearers and rights holders? So maybe Ben, we'll start with you from the OHCHR. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of the co-organizers, fellow panelists, and audience. It's my pleasure to be here today and look forward to our discussion. So I'm going to start off with some reflections on the linkages between biodiversity and human rights. First of all, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity are an essential element of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And we heard already from Astrid, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, about this. Biodiversity loss undermines not just the right to a healthy environment, but all human rights, including the rights to life, health, food, water, cultural rights, and Indigenous peoples' rights, among others. And this is a clear reflection of the interdependence of all human rights. the right to a healthy environment, including a healthy biodiversity and ecosystems, is therefore essential for human well-being and the enjoyment of all human rights for present and future generations. Everyone is a rights holder, as everyone's rights can be affected by biodiversity loss. But there is a disproportionate impact on the people most dependent on biodiversity, many of whom are already in vulnerable situations. So biodiversity loss in particular has impacts on those who depend directly on nature for their livelihoods and culture, and those already in vulnerable situations. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework clearly calls for a human rights-based approach, which respects, protects, promotes, and fulfills human rights in its implementation. And human rights-based approach to the conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and the equitable distribution of its benefits is both a matter of obligation under international human rights law, and it's essential for more effective policy. Importantly, it's not just states that are duty bearers under human rights law. Businesses also have a responsibility to respect human rights. And I want to leave with just a sort of final thought on the question about the importance of integrating human rights and biodiversity action. I spoke already towards the legal obligations, and certainly there's a moral and ethical responsibility, but it's also clear from the work of the panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, that the diverse values and valuation of nature, rights-based approaches to conservation contribute to achieve effective and just conservation outcomes while addressing erosion of both cultural and biological diversity. So human rights, including the right to a healthy environment, are essential for the effective implementation of the global biodiversity framework. And there again, it's just the fact that the human right to a healthy environment very clearly illustrates that human rights and protection of the environment are inextricably intertwined. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ben, and particularly for the last remark that it's not just the desirability of the human rights framework, but also more effective for conservation results and outcomes. So I don't know, Sefa, would you like to comment on this?
Okay, I can go next, and thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation to be here. I see the interlinkages between biodiversity and human rights kind of most clearly when I look at our communities here in the Cordillera. Our communities, including elders, women, and youth, are doing so much to care for our lands and for our communities and for future generations to live well, right? And we do this through values and knowledge passed on by our elders, and we care for nature in so many different ways, like sustainable agriculture, arts and culture, research, education, monitoring, and things like that. And we're able to do this well when we are safe and when we have security of tenure and security in general. So the reality, the very difficult reality to grapple with, is that those who steward biodiversity, including Indigenous peoples, or those who have, or even those who have played little to no part in causing the current biodiversity crisis, like children and youth, are really those who are being impacted the most. And so more must be done to ensure that our rights are being respected in the face of pressures and impacts of biodiversity loss, and also as we carry out biodiversity action. I think that the current youth movement and also the long-running Indigenous movement has really centered our fight for the environment around justice and equity. Because we know from our lived experiences, right, that losing our forests, losing our lands means losing culture and identity and the fabric of our communities. And also we know from history that what is behind this loss has really been systems of inequality and injustice and the disregard for human rights. And so, yeah, because all of us rely on biodiversity and we all rely on the biodiversity-rich areas that Indigenous people steward, all actors really need to put human rights at the center of biodiversity action. And this is why it's so important. And just to end, the core responsibility is, of course, with states, but it is also with businesses, with conservation organizations, with different people and sectors who are duty bearers and who can support duty bearers to carry out their obligations, and also to help rights holders demand and realize their rights. Yeah, back to you, Taryn.
Thank you, Sefa. So you mentioned the topic of land tenure and land security. Phoebe, this is something that you work on in Kenya in Mount Elgon. There have been some progress in the sub-STIRT negotiations to include a new indicator for the GBF on land tenure, which will be discussed at COP16. So would you like to comment as well, please?
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Stefan and Ben, on those. And thinking from there, the aspect of interlink between biodiversity and human rights, I'll look at it from the practical perspective. Coming from an indigenous community that lives inside the forest, if you look at thriving of biodiversity, you cannot live outside the aspect of human rights. And the same aspects that applies to protecting the rights of human beings, because as indigenous people, our lives entirely depends on natural resources. That is, if you look at source of food, shelter, medicine, and even like aspects of spiritual and cultural, we get all of them from the biodiversity. So that one brings an interlink that all of them are depend on each other for survival, and that's it is important to ensure that when discussing about protection of biodiversity, you should ensure that you discuss the aspect of respecting the human rights. These calls, therefore, you cannot say that, for example, you want to protect wildlife or maybe plants, and you're not respecting the call of human beings to clean and healthy as well as sustainable environment. So, and I see it as an important aspect to ensure that the call of biodiversity action respect human rights, because the human beings entirely depend on biodiversity for survival. And traditionally, they have been conserving and they have been protecting. So ensuring that you put into action their efforts in conserving biodiversity is important. And then also, if you look at the duty bearers and the right holders, or in regards to biodiversity and human rights, I can say that everyone has a role to play. But majorly, those who are vulnerable to it, the young children and the future generation, it is so unfair for the current generation not to protect the biodiversity, knowing very well that the adverse impacts are felt by the future generation. So therefore, it is good to look at it from the vulnerability perspective, and then also the duty bearers. You find that the people, like the policy makers, the conservation policy makers, and the government agencies who come up with these regulations that guide biodiversity protections, have a very big role to play, as it determines whether the human rights aspect will be respected or it will not be respected. So it is a call to them that whenever they come up with these policies, they ensure that all they involve the right holders who are vulnerable to the effects of biodiversity laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe, Sefa, and Ben. So a couple of keywords that I think have been mentioned on multiple occasions are interdependence and indivisibility, which are words we associate with the human rights framework, but these could equally well be applied to the indivisibility between human beings and their environment. One of the topics we might come back to is the emerging framework on the rights of nature, which is complementary to the framework on human rights. There are some different positions on this in terms of how that could be reflected in the rights-based approach under the GBF. We will now move to the next area in the discussion, which is around challenges and opportunities at national, regional, as well as local and global levels. So the question maybe we'll start with you, Phoebe, but the question is what are the main challenges and opportunities for incorporating a human rights-based approach for the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of biodiversity? Over to you. You're on mute.
Sorry, looking at it, there's a wider challenges and as well as opportunities, but the first challenges that I look at from the Indigenous perspective is lack of ownership, full ownership of lands. Looking at all these, it starts from the tenure rights. So when other people are following up on the aspect of implementation of GBF, the Indigenous people are following up on, or rather fighting for this, the struggle for recognition of the land aspect. So that one is a major challenge mostly, and I think it trickles down from the local to international levels. And then also you find that it is a challenge where there is a lack of recognition of Indigenous people in most of the countries. And I find that when policies are being passed, when the decision is being made that to create more, for example, protected areas, you find that the protected areas are created in the territories of Indigenous people, meaning that they say Indigenous people are supposed to move to pave way for the protected areas, meaning that they don't value their participation or rather their input, and they don't consider them as part of ecosystem that are supposed to occupy those particular territories. And then also you find that it is a challenge that there is no access of information. GBF has a very clear guide, but looking at the grassroots level, where these all frameworks are supposed to be implemented, or rather they're supposed to practically take action, you find that majority of the people are not aware of even this framework. So it remains a challenge. And looking at the NBSAPs, for example, you find that they are done at the national level, but practicality of it, most of the people are at a subnational level or grassroots level. Therefore, it remains a big challenge that needs maybe to trickle down the NBSAPs process into the community or grassroots level. And then looking at the opportunities, you find that these all process, we have platforms like the IIFB. It gives a clear platform, or rather the opportunity for Indigenous people to give their inputs. And the latest one was at Substar and the SBI conference in Nairobi. So I see this as an opportunity for Indigenous people to air their views. And then also you find that currently the big research institution or learning institution, the likes of Oxford University, are now willing to collaborate with Indigenous people in ensuring that they incorporate the traditional knowledge of conservation with the scientific knowledge of conservation. So that one, I look at that as an opportunity. And then also looking at it, the willingness of the entire GBF to adopt, or rather to incorporate the Indigenous people's way of life and recognizing their right to land, is an opportunity for Indigenous people to take part and to take shape in pushing on their issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. So you mentioned the topic of NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, as both a challenge in terms of they're not very well known. There've been maybe challenges in terms of participation in the past, but of course, this is also a huge opportunity. So the focus now on this integration between nature and climate is pushing NBSAPs further forward in terms of their prominence, so that they would not be considered in some respects the lesser brother or sister of the NDCs. So maybe I'll come to you, Ben, in terms of the guidance that OHCHR has provided on NBSAPs and how that's going, and then maybe we'll come to you, Sefa, on the whole of society approach. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Terence. And yeah, I mean, on that point, OHCHR working with the partners in the environment management group, issue management group on human rights and environment, has developed a guidance on integrating human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And before developing that guidance, we undertook a survey of NBSAPs that were on the record at the time of our research, which was around 2021, I want to say, into this subject, and so looked at all of the NBSAPs that were at that time submitted, the most up-to-date ones, and found really that there was almost no integration of human rights within national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and where there was, it was not necessarily as meaningful, substantial, or impactful as it should be. And so there's definitely a lot of work to do in terms of improving the integration of rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And we hope that guidance, which I'll share later in the chat, is helpful in supporting that work. And I'd say just in that regard, and there may be a couple of other challenges I want to reference, but all of these challenges are also opportunities, right? And so with the NBSAP renewal or revision process that is meant to follow the adoption of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there's a lot of clear signaling in the Global Biodiversity Framework about the importance of human rights, specific targets addressing human rights, the considerations for implementation, emphasizing human rights-based approach, right to a healthy environment, rights of Indigenous peoples, gender equality. So there's a real opportunity to take that and work with states to put it into practice. What I wanted to flag maybe in terms of a couple of other challenges / opportunities are, one is there's a tendency for government and other institutions working in this space to work in silos, that we need a multidisciplinary approach. We need work happening across ministries, and I'd say in particular, for example, environment, finance, and foreign ministries actually need to come together and have a coordinated approach to biodiversity issues if there's going to be any real chance to transform the way that we approach nature. But there is an opportunity to do that, and the Global Biodiversity Plan has the signaling and the guidance that's needed to facilitate that work. The incoming presidency for COP, with its emphasis on peace with nature, also is really showing leadership with respect to how to get this done. So I think COP16 offers some clear opportunities to better integrate rights in the guidance for implementing the framework. And then the other two things maybe I'd flag are just resources and participation and inclusiveness, right? So, I mean, there are not nearly enough resources being put into protecting the environment, the conservation and sustainable use. And in fact, there continues to be a tremendous amount of resources that go into subsidizing environmentally destructive activities. So there is an opportunity to change the way that we fund, the way, and by we I mean the international community, states, etc., fund action and fund, public services and development projects, etc., so that biodiversity is integrated throughout, and so that we're subsidizing things that protect people on the planet. We're not subsidizing environmentally destructive activities. And then the participation and inclusion. I mean, the reality is that environmental decision-making processes have historically not been inclusive. And that's led to poor decision-making. It's led to, fortress conservation, which has excluded the people who often are really essential to protecting particular ecosystems from decision-making about them. And if we can correct that, we have a real opportunity to capitalize on the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and other people who are living in close in a close relationship with nature, and work together, all of us, to protect the environment better. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. We'll come back in the fourth segment to the COP16 and the kind of forward-looking aspects. But just sticking now with the NBSAP topic, Sefa, I know the Human Rights and Biodiversity Working Group conducted a survey of a number of countries on engagement of civil society, Indigenous people, local communities in NBSAPs, and this was presented at the Substa. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Terence. And indeed, there is a coalition of organizations, civil society organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations, women, youth, and also UN agencies that are kind of collectively working on strengthening human rights-based approaches in biodiversity and in the work of the CBD. And I would refer you to our work to assess the participation of civil society in NBSAP revision processes. And also we have provided some guidance also on integrating human rights-based approach that would be complementary to many of the materials that Ben has shared. So I completely agree with many of the points that Phoebe and Ben have already told us in terms of challenges and opportunities, but this really is one, is to harness the experiences of on-ground conservation actors who are really the best informed, best suited to guide governance of biodiversity in their areas, in their territories, and kind of making sure that we are, or on-ground actors are partners in conservation and are fully engaged in those planning and decision-making processes like NBSAPs, because not only, again, is it a moral and legal obligation, but it really makes for more effective and equitable plans and policies and actions. And then maybe just to add, beyond the processes, the foundations should also be there. And so we need those policy frameworks that recognize rights. We need governments that value human rights and human life and well-being. And we need transformative education that really shifts values away from prioritizing infinite growth over the well-being of the people. And yeah, we need, for example, spaces for civic engagement. Sorry, just briefly to add one challenge and opportunity that is very important to me is really the threats that environmental defenders face, because the reality is that the people who are themselves defending the environment are at risk and need to be protected. This is something that we face at home. My family is under threat for the work that they do in defending land rights. So this is a key challenge, and protecting environmental defenders is an important element, again, to the foundations and enabling environment for a human rights-based approach.
Thank you, Sefa. And on the point, there is the UNEP OHCHR guidance also to UN country teams on environmental human rights defenders, which we can also put in someone can put in the chat. So now we'll turn to the third topic, which is around best practices. So if each one of you could give us maybe one or two examples of best practices, which might include strategies, they might include particular guidelines or flagship initiatives or projects that you're working on or familiar with. So maybe we'll start with Phoebe and then come to Ben and Sefa. Phoebe, over to you.
Thank you. So I will give two. So the first one is communities are already self-developing community-led biodiversity monitoring systems. And these systems are there so that they can be able to demonstrate their stewardship in how well they can conserve biodiversity. And then also you find that most of the indigenous communities are also trying to come up with a spatial plan of their territories. And through these spatial plans, they're now trying to push, though it is a bit hard, but they're trying to push for recognitions of this spatial plan, both at the local and national and even international platforms, as this gives a clear reflection of how they are utilizing available resources sustainably. And the last one is the fact that communities are trying to document the traditional knowledge practices and innovations in biodiversity conservation and collaborating with the research agencies, as I had mentioned earlier. And this one will be able to be adopted by scientists as they come up with policies that are supposed to be adopted to guide in terms of biodiversity conservations. Thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe, for that example on community-based monitoring systems that you're working on. I just add, there's also the Indigenous Navigator that Indigenous led in terms of data collection on SDGs that is a related initiative. I'll turn in a minute to one of the questions in the chat, but maybe Ben, if you could comment on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So first of all, I think there's a number of interesting examples and initiatives out there, and some of the basic, like, I'd say promising practices or good practices we see, right? I mean, one is just recognizing Indigenous people's lands, resources, and rights over their lands, resources, territories, and traditional knowledge that has real benefits across a variety of meta-analyses with respect to conservation of nature and also with respect to climate change. And so, human rights obligation, it has benefits for the environment. This is something that should be considered low-hanging fruit, but is unfortunately really difficult to achieve. We're really glad that the Global Biodiversity Framework includes explicit language about respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, resources, and territories within its targets. I think it's just a question of how do we get to better implementation, because there have been decisions by courts at national and regional levels, particularly in the Americas, calling for enforcement and recognition of those rights. But the implementation continues to struggle and lag behind in many cases, as just an example. We have a number of initiatives we're working on and exploring with partners, including to develop guidance with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity on human rights-based approaches and specific targets of the KMGBF. Ideally, one day, the entire framework, but starting with and focusing on the frameworks which have very explicit human rights the targets with very explicit human rights elements. So targets 3, 21, 22, and 23, and section C of the framework. And also in terms of ongoing discussions with IUCN and other partners about identifying promising practices where a human rights-based approach is actually being effectively applied to conservation, sustainable use, and so on and so forth. And you see that sometimes in areas like community-led fisheries management, or other kinds of community-led sustainable resource management. So there are examples. It's just a question of how do you scale that? How do you transform it into different contexts and translate it into different contexts? And that's the work that we need to do.
Thanks, Ben, for the comment that even with positive laws and policies, if they're not implemented, then we won't see the expected results. And so, in some countries there are recognition of the rights of nature, but those really need to have a full backing from all the actors in those countries. So now we'll turn to Sefa for best practices, and then to the question in the chat. Sefa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I'll share a few. So one best practice is really to support self-determined biodiversity actions that communities themselves have determined is best for their land, right? So an example here in the Philippines is we have under my other organization, Partners for Indigenous Knowledge Philippines, we are doing work to support the people of Busao Mountain Province to revitalize their indigenous food systems. And these initiatives are a good example of kind of a more holistic approach to biodiversity, to indigenous knowledge, to community well-being, and to human rights. So supporting those kinds of initiatives, whether or not they are familiar with the Global Biodiversity Framework or not, right? Those are very key contributors to implementing our global targets. At the national level, again, in the Philippines, we have a collective or a coalition of organizations of indigenous peoples organizations that are doing work to influence NBSAPs and really being proactive in terms of developing contributions. And the government has been receiving these with appreciation. For youth, I wanted to share that also many chapters of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network are also participating and in their own NBSAP processes and making sure that their national policies take into consideration priorities from young people. And another example, for example, here in Southeast Asia, the Southeast Asia chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network is doing mapping on youth contributions to the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. These kinds of initiatives really help in many different kinds of ways, including monitoring and also making visible the contributions of youth, of communities to the targets, and making sure these reach decision makers and that these are taken into account in decision making.
Thank you, Sefa. So I'll turn to the question now from Marina von Weissenberg in the chat. I think as panelists you can see it. And the question is as follows: is the governance system in place to integrate and implement the human rights approaches, including promoting systemic regeneration? The policy and legal frameworks at the moment need attention. We need natural, social, and human capital protocols, and that's a question. There's a question mark on that. Would one of you like to comment on this?
I think that is a little bit complicated. I mean, there are government systems in place that should support integration of human rights, including with respect to regeneration, if the reference is to sort of regenerative agriculture, restoration of ecosystems, etc. They can be strengthened and should be strengthened. when you start talking about all of these different sort of protocols related to capital, I mean, I think you have to sort of break down and look at each of those areas specifically. I don't know if Marina wants to perhaps add a little bit or share a little bit more with respect to the question itself. That might be useful in terms of responding
maybe
better to
Marina,
it.
Yeah, maybe Marina, if you could just open your mic and you speak to this. We have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, hello, and sorry for this complicated question maybe, but this is, hi Marina from Finland. And why I'm asking this question is that I was attending a meeting in Paris last week. And the issue of human rights issue also in the banking sector, in finance sector is growing, which is excellent, because I think that's the carrot and the stick also for some maybe parties, which I feel are going backwards instead of onwards on these issues, unfortunately, due to my experiences from international negotiations. But in that regard, there is a work ongoing on management by impact. And they are working on these different protocols, where now the social protocol is coming. And I think that element is maybe a bit loose still there, but I think we have a fantastic opportunity if we integrate these issues as well in not only guidance, but in protocols which are standards for many important also business sector, but also for organizations, maybe a little bit outside of the box, could I say. So that's what I think is my point here, that there are a lot of things that we may not be thinking of, but just last week I learned about the management by impact, and of course for EMG I think this would also be, and I can come back to Jannika on that, but there are opportunities to maybe gather networking and partnership with organizations which is a little bit out of the box, which are working on very important human and social capital protocols. That's my point, and thanks for a great event, by the way.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, I think there is this almost demand from some private sector for more protocols, more guidance, more metrics on how to measure ESG, environmental, social, and governance aspects, including on human rights. So this is definitely an area that I think we'll see increased attention. And maybe the EMG, Ben, we'll see how this can play out. So we still have this to the last segment of this webinar, which is around the CBD COP16, which is coming up in Cali, Colombia. So I'll turn to the three speakers again and ask each of them in the light of the COP16, what are the key human rights considerations in the negotiations and the expected outcomes that either you're focusing on or that you think are particularly critical. So maybe we'll start with Sefer, then turn to Phoebe, and then Ben. And the floor. Please add your comments in the chat as well.
Okay, I'll start. One thing that we're particularly looking at is the continued integration of human rights at the NBSAP level. And countries do have a deadline by COP16 to do this, but many countries will also kind of continue to do this even after COP16. So COP16 might be a key point to continue to push for the gains that we did get in the global biodiversity framework. Like many important elements in the global biodiversity framework were really advocated for a long time with so much effort, and they are now very I would say they are very important elements of the global biodiversity framework, including indigenous people's rights, intergenerational equity, a human rights-based approach. Target 22 as a whole is a very important and enabling target for the global biodiversity framework as a whole. So I feel that the next step is really still ensuring that those gains are reflected in national policies. and yeah, making sure that they actually make impact on the ground where it matters. Another is the resource mobilization discussion and ensuring that those resources are reaching on-ground actors, including Indigenous peoples, local communities, women, youth, faster and more directly, because this is still not happening and it's really slowing down, I suppose, progress towards attaining the targets of the GBF. And then I also emphasize that it's important for the CBD to recognize in COP16 the gap that it has with, with regards to human rights, both in implementation and in monitoring. And first recognizing that and ensuring that there is a pathway to fill those gaps in the future. And being clear about it and explicit about it, that that is something that is still missing and that needs more work. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So, and making the linkages with the resource mobilization and the access to finance as well for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other civil society actors. So over to you now, Phoebe.
Okay, thank you. So for me, I'm looking at it, like the key consideration should be now coming up, or rather developing a clear plan on how to document and integrate Indigenous and traditional territories zonation plans. I'm saying this because the GBF has captured clearly a lot of good guidelines, good principles, but now COP16 should look at it on how to actualize this framework. And then also another thing in my wish as a key consideration is also to during the COP16 deliberation should look at how to support documentation of traditional practices that are effective in maintaining and in restoring biodiversity. And then also another key consideration should be how to better support the development and application of community protocols, because you find that the framework has captured ways that it will support the grassroots communities, but there is nothing that is happening at the grassroots level in terms of implementation. So I feel like it is high time to start conversation on how to actualize entire framework in individual communities. And also, this is the main one also is to look on how to conduct consultation at subnational levels, especially the NB-subs, how to trickle the NB-sub conversation into subnational levels, even to grassroots level, to ensure that there is guarantee, or rather more participation of Indigenous people and local communities and those who are vulnerable, the women, and also how to ensure that the entire framework is broken down, or rather is developed in a way that can be understood by those who are knowledgeable, but not in terms of maybe what can I say? There are those who are rich in traditional knowledge, but they cannot read or write. So I'm looking at it like COP16 should come up with strategies on how to ensure that this frameworks is friendly to the bigger percentage of such individuals. So, and long-term outcome of it is just to implement the entire GBF in the grassroots level. That is what the key consideration I would suggest. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Phoebe. So the reference to the subnational level, we also heard from Astrid in her keynote about the role of cities and how important they are in making the connections between cities and rural areas. I think in the COP usually there is a focus on the role of urban and city environments. I invite Astrid, if she's still with us, also to join the panel in this wrap-up session. So Ben, what are the key aspects for you at this COP16?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Terence. I think first of all, as Safa mentioned, the preparations and the things being done before COP16 are also really important. So NBSAP's, of course, working with states to more effectively integrate human rights in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Having an inclusive and participatory conference of parties. So, I mean, we look at both the sort of process and the outcomes that we'd like to see achieved from the process. And with all of our engagement, OHCHR's engagement and environmental discussions and processes, we really want to emphasize the importance of making sure that it is inclusive and participatory, and that environmental human rights defenders are safe and secure in their participation and free from reprisals for exercising their rights to expression, assembly, etc. In terms of outcomes, we've been engaged in a number of the preparatory negotiations, the SBSTA, the SBI, the open-ended working group on Article 8J. And there is bracketed in, I think, almost all cases, if not all cases, human rights language already in a number of texts that have been forwarded to the COP. So we're talking about references to a human rights-based approach to biodiversity action as a new area of work under the CBD, and cooperation between OHCHR and the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, rights-based approaches to conservation in the context of topics proposed to the IPBEST for fast-track assessment, text on human rights-based approaches and the protection of ocean defenders with respect to the items on marine biodiversity that are being considered. SEFA raised the monitoring and implementation framework. We're quite interested in strengthening that framework, and it seems like there's a real opportunity to do so with respect to a headline indicator on Target 22 related to land use change and land tenure of Indigenous peoples. But frankly, we'd like to go beyond that and see headline indicators in other places. That might be an ongoing discussion looking even past COP16. Article 8J, there is and will be a continuing discussion of whether or not to establish a permanent subsidiary body working on issues related to Indigenous people's traditional knowledge and of a new program of work under this area. We'd like to see progress there. Those of you following those discussions may know one of the major areas of contention has to do with the use of and the lack of differentiation between the use of the term Indigenous peoples and local communities, and some lack of clarity with respect to the differentiation between Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's an area that will have to continue to be discussed, and we hope can be resolved in a way that is agreeable to rights holders and member states, so that work in this area can move forward. And then finance. Is another big one.
Thanks, Ben. Before turning to you, Astrid, just to say that the Colombian government is also focusing on the rights of Afro-descendant populations as a particular topic for this COP in that specific area of Cali in Colombia. And so in relation to your point about the language on Indigenous peoples and local communities, there is a request for the CBD to recognize Afro-descendant populations also more explicitly, especially in the Latin American context. And of course, many of you will know that there is a pre-summit on the topic of traditional knowledge being organized by the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So returning to you now, Astrid, if you'd like to comment on any of the points that have been made.
Thank you very much. And yeah, so thinking about the COP and what is that we would like to be seeing as outcomes, I mean, adding would it has been said. I think that one of the key aspects also is that hopefully we can see that the states are learning from the past and avoid continue doing the same and profounding some of the big mistakes or things that need to be improved. And in that, I would like also to refer specifically to the new markets for nature markets. That's one of the things that several of us have been concerned also to see how this will be implemented with human rights at the center and communities. And so that we hopefully will be preventing continuing the same mistakes, for example, as the carbon market. So that's one of the things that I really wanted to say, because that's a source of concern as well. Related with the Afro-descendant communities, yes, that's a key aspect that, as you mentioned, Colombia has as a priority. And as Ben also mentioned, one of the challenges that we have today is how to solve also, in legally speaking, how to protect both indigenous peoples and strong legal protection of Afro-descendant communities, peasant communities, or campesinos, as it's called, fisher folks, because different regions also have different realities. So of course, in the Americas and again, I mean, this is a consequence of centuries of exclusion and discrimination. And so of course, we need to have strong protection for Afro-descendant communities in a way that it makes sense and is strong for the Americas, but also of course for Africa and for other regions where this differentiation has a very different, of course, context. There has been a lot of advance, fortunately, on how to incorporate and deal with this actual asymmetries and discrimination. And so I think that this is a key aspect. And I really look forward to see that the decisions are actually inclusive and that we are able to advance in recognizing that there is knowledge also in indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities that have been sometimes excluded and marginalized, but there is a lot of scientific knowledge there. And so hopefully we'll be able to include it not in an extractive way, but protecting human rights and their rights and actually sharing benefits. So I will like to close that, and hopefully also seeing some key also conclusions to advance responsibility as well, and accountability, which is something that we're pending to see. So, and that's where we also see the importance of not only talk about conservation from now on, but also to deal with the reparations and compensations that are pending to be seen. And this is a key aspect, for example, that both the Colombian government and Afro-descendant communities have systematically also called for.
Thank you so much, Astrid. And maybe just to add one comment from the UNDP side, a priority for the COP16 and going into next year's COP30 in Brazil, in Belém, will be the more integrated approach to the planning of nature and climate actions, so that this, we touched upon it earlier in the discussion on NBSAPs and nationally determined contributions, and the initiative within Colombia to build on a common foundation for these planning frameworks, and how, as UNDP, this could be better integrated in the future. So we have a few minutes left. I see one interesting comment in the chat. It's quite a long one. I think people can read that, but it's linked to the topic of how human rights considerations are linked to environmental and social safeguards. And Jake Willis is saying that a major gap remains on how many of these safeguard mechanisms are front-loaded and are not sufficiently linked to program or project sort of implementation as part of the not just the design of the project, but the implementation. So this is something, at least from where I sit, in terms of the Jeff Small Grants program and the support that UNDP provides through the SGP directly to indigenous peoples and local communities, where many of these safeguards elements are are more woven into the very design of how demand-driven proposals are received from those stakeholders. I don't know if SEPA or CB, if you'd like to comment on this question of a more positive do good kind of approach rather than do no harm for safeguards in project design. Well, if you're thinking about it, just to say that there are various principles that have been the draft principles on access to finance, which I think will be discussed also, side events that are being prepared on this through the interagency support group on Indigenous issues, different UN agencies on access to finance. Sefa, I think you were going to say something, and I'll pass to Astrid afterwards.
Yeah, maybe just briefly that this is something we're also trying to advocate for in the discussions at COP16, is trying to ensure that financial mechanisms have strong social and environmental safeguards. And like aside from the access issue, there's also the ensuring the safeguards issue, and that human rights are really at the center of these kinds of mechanisms. And just building on another point that was mentioned earlier on climate and biodiversity, for example, making sure that we avoid false solutions there also, and try to safeguard against the harm that could potentially come from solutions or market-based approaches that are not really solutions, that could potentially cause more harm than good. So that's another thing that we as the youth are looking at.
Yeah, so I think there will be events by the Biodiversity Credits Alliance as well planned for COP16 to discuss the advisory committee on the biodiversity credits emerging framework. Over to you, Astrid.
Thank you very much, Terence. On the question about safeguards in general, I just want to remind ourselves that we're not starting from scratch. Human rights has decades of development. And so, of course, when we're including human rights perspective to conservation, it's kind of a new, or can be seen as a new thing, but it is not new. We have decades of interpretation, both internationally, regionally, and nationally, about what does it mean to have access to information, access to participation, access to justice, how can the collaboration be done. And so it's, of course, a matter of will to incorporate that and to be able to catalyze, and as I say, also in nature, to pollinize these two worlds that have been, or three worlds that have been very separated, but we also only have one planet, and there's a lot of knowledge already to understand this, and to remember also that when we're talking about safeguards, it's guidelines, but we are talking about human rights obligations, both, as we have talked in this event, both from state and non-state actors as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Astrid. So we have just 5 minutes left before turning to Yannicka for the closing words from the EMG. I'll just give all four speakers the opportunity to make a final quick remark. So we'll start with you, Phoebe, and then go to Sefa, Ben, and then Astrid.
Okay, mine is to thank all the conveners of this webinar and all participants. And my plea to all of us, either if you're involved in the process of COP, there are those ones who started the process way earlier when it began, and then there are those who started picking it in the middle. But my plea to it is to ensure that we push for actual implementation of an entire GBF so that we don't elongate the process of developing more and more principles, or rather targets. Rather, we should now focus into implementing the GBF. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. Implementation. Ben, Sefa, then Ben.
Thank you, Terence, and thanks everyone for joining us for this discussion. Yeah, it's I don't have much to add except to just re-emphasize how important it is to understand what it means to implement a human rights-based approach and to actually implement it. Yeah, just to say again that this is important to actually ensuring that we reach the vision of living in harmony with nature, and making sure that our biodiversity actions in the end are addressing the root causes of biodiversity loss and are really creating transformative change and not just, addressing the symptoms of the crisis that we are living.
Thank you so much, Stepha. Ben, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Maybe two things. One would be consistency and coherence across different multilateral spaces. There is a real, I think, concerted effort by some parties to silo biodiversity and human rights and development and economic discussions from each other. And when you do that, you can't have effective action anywhere. So we are engaging to mainstream the right to healthy environment across these different multilateral processes, and you have to understand the relationships and how they interact and intersect with each other in order to advance. So having that holistic and whole of society approach is critical. And the other is to really not forget about and to address the role of businesses and the responsibility of businesses to address and be accountable for their contributions to biodiversity loss and ecosystem damage, because it's too often left out of the discussion. This is not a problem that's just because of states or just because of certain human rights actors. It's a problem that involves a lot of people and a lot of actors doing the wrong thing. So we need to turn everybody around, all of these institutions, actors, governments, in order to address it.
Thanks, Ben. I think this may be one of the key messages coming out from this webinar on the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, that we really cannot silo human rights in one corner, conservation in another corner, and climate in another one. So for the final remarks, Astrid, and then we'll turn to Jan.
Thank you very much. I really just want to re-emphasize what Phoebe, Sefa, and Ben have said, and remind ourselves about the huge historical challenge that we have. It's not only the biodiversity framework, or it's not a paper, it's not a program that we're talking about, is saving the biodiversity, solving the climate change, making sure that we are solving the pollution that nature today, nature is living today because of human activity. So it's a huge challenge, of course, but one that we need to implement, as they said, focusing on implementation. We don't have time to do yet another framework, another convention, another program. We need to implement things and listen to voices in the ground. And in that sense, we all are in the ground because we all live in territories. Whether we live in a city or in the forest, those are territories. And so I really want to highlight that, to be able, hopefully, to deal with our inconsistencies today and plant the seeds that we need for the forest that we need to see later in the following decades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid. And so I'd like to thank all of the panelists today, and then pass the floor to Janneke for the final remarks.
Thanks so much, Terence and everyone. It's been a really interesting webinar where we had the chance to discuss the importance and opportunities that applying a human rights-based approach in the complex context of biodiversity provides. And I would really like to take the chance to thank Astrid for taking the time to be with us here today and for so elegantly setting the scene, highlighting the need for humanity to reconnect to nature and the importance and also effectiveness of protecting nature and human rights together, catalyzing action at the intersection of human rights and biodiversity. And also equally big thanks to our panelists, Phoebe, Sefa, and Ben, for sharing your insights and experience, and to you, Terence, for an excellent facilitation of a smooth discussion. We've talked about co-responsibility and the importance of participation and inclusion, involving different types of actors and including the grassroots level as well, which will lead to more effective and more equitable plans. We've highlighted concepts such as interdependence and indivisibility of human rights, human beings, and nature, emphasizing in particular the dependence of Indigenous peoples on nature and also the vulnerability of future generations and their dependence on our decision-making today. We've seen that there is a wealth of guidance, frameworks, and good practices, but the question now is really how to get to a better implementation of these and how to scale up all the good practice that exists, applying it to different contexts. In the context of the UN interagency collaboration on biodiversity and the UN common approach to biodiversity, we have the aspiration to strengthen cross-sectoral collaboration and to make the connections between different UN entities and their mandates, respecting the indivisibility of environmental sustainability and biodiversity with the other dimensions of the sustainability agenda. And we hope to, through this common approach, be able to promote consistency and coherence, as Ben mentioned, and to help us get out of the silos in implementing this in a holistic manner. The EMG is also supporting UN entities in applying environmental and social standards and safeguards, as was also mentioned today, in UN programming. And for this, we have a model approach where the human rights-based approach is a fundamental guiding principle. Thank you also so much for the questions that we received, and thanks for the idea of networking outside the box. Marina, happy to connect with you to see what we can do within the EMG to support this. And now, having gone slightly over time, I would just like to again thank you all for participating today, and to invite you to stay tuned for future sessions in the series of webinars on the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, which you will be able to see on the EMG website, unemg.org. With these words, I'd like to conclude the event and look forward to seeing you in upcoming webinars on biodiversity and other topics. From the EMG Secretariat side, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.